A little over a year ago, I took a hike in Anza Borrego State Park. I know it's a great place. So it's a hike through a slot canyon. Now, a slot canyon is a narrow fissure in sedimentary rock, formed, as I understand it, when water finds a weak spot and runs through, eroding softer rock and leaving behind that which is harder and more immovable. So to get into the slot canyon, you descend down at a spot where sand has drifted in and made sort of this loose mound. And then you follow the winding path, sometimes quite narrow, with high cliffs of rock on either side. It was a really fun hike for me. My lupus makes me sun sensitive, and 20 to 50-foot walls on either side made for great shade. It was incredibly beautiful and a lot of fun, because sometimes we had to squeeze through narrow passages or clamber over rock formations, or even in a couple of places get on our hands and knees and crawl through tunnels and caves. But what I appreciated most was the chance to think in geologic time, which somehow I find very reassuring. I remember looking at the layers exposed in the rock, and it's tempting to try and count them like tree rings, but our guidebook informed us that it wasn't that simple. It identified particular geologic events preserved forever by a band of particular color halfway down the cliff. And the numbers that went along with the events that corresponded to the colored bands, the numbers that went along with them were humongous. 3.5 million, 5 million, 30 million, 105 million, 170 million. And these numbers are so big that my mind, at least, almost can't grasp them, especially when I think about the fact that our species has only been around for 200,000 years. Rocks teach us patience and perspective. They feel solid, unchangeable, and immovable, when in fact they are permeable and as transient as the rest of the planet. There are unstoppable forces, wind and water, plate tectonics, that shape and carve and transform them. But rarely does that change happen at a speed that the human eye can observe. Last Sunday, Jamie spoke about impossible problems, those moral or ethical dilemma that don't have any good answers. Our reading spoke of unavoidable givens, hard truths about reality that every human bumps up against. Everything changes and ends. Things do not always go according to plan. Life is not always fair. Pain is a part of life. And people are not loving and loyal all of the time. How much time have we wasted trying to fix these 5 problems that are intrinsic to being human? These problems that are completely universal and completely unavoidable. I think about situations that bring us face to face with our own powerlessness. When someone we love is ill or dying and we can only stand by and watch, or when we can see disaster unfolding and there's just nothing we can do. In fact, much of life falls into the category of stuff I can't do anything about. And that's hard. But like the stonecutter in our story, sometimes our quest to become more powerful can be a distraction, leading us away from the power we actually have in a vain quest to control something that isn't meant to be controlled. In his essay, Thinking Like a Mountain, found in Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold writes, "A deep, chesty ball echoes from rim rock to rim rock, rolls down the mountain and fades into the far blackness of the night. It is an outburst of wild, defiant sorrow and of contempt for all the adversities of the world. Every living thing, and perhaps many a dead one as well, pays heed to that call. To the deer, it is a reminder of the way of all flesh. To the pine, a forecast of midnight scuffles and of blood upon the snow. To the coyote, a promise of gleanings to come. To the cowman, a threat of red ink at the bank. To the hunter, a challenge of fang against bullet. Yet behind these obvious and immediate hopes and fears, there lies a deeper meaning known only to the mountain itself. Only the mountain has lived long enough to listen objectively to the howl of a wolf. He then shares an account of shooting a wolf as a young man, the personal moment of awareness he had watching the light fade from her eyes. Leopold goes on to point out all the ways in which wolves play a pivotal role in the ecosystem, highlighting the fact that when humans kill off the wolves, the deer population explodes and strips the mountainside of vegetation and causes irreparable harm. He continues, I now suspect that just as a deer herd lives in mortal fear of its wolves, so does a mountain live in mortal fear of its deer. And perhaps with better cause, for while a buck pulled down by wolves can be replaced in 2 or 3 years, a range pulled down by too many deer may fail to replace itself in as many decades. So also with cows. The cowman who cleans his range of wolves does not realize that he's taking over the wolf's job of trimming the herd to fit the range. He has not learned to think like a mountain. Hence we have dust bowls and rivers washing the future into the sea. We all strive for safety, prosperity, comfort, long life, and dullness. The deer strives with his supple legs, the cowman with trap and poison, the statesman with pen, the most of us with machines, votes, and dollars. But it all comes to the same thing, peace in our time. A measure of success in this is all well enough, and perhaps is a requisite to objective thinking. But too much safety seems to yield only danger in the long run. Perhaps this is behind Thoreau's dictum, in wildness is the salvation of the world. The story of what happened to the ecosystem in Yellowstone when wolves were reintroduced proves Leopold's point. I'm sure many of you have read about it. The wolves kept the elk from overpopulating and stripping the willows, which allowed the beavers to come back, damming the rivers and streams so that the songbirds came back. Killing off the wolves in the first place seemed, I am sure, like a reasonable thing to do. They killed livestock and other edibles, and so were competition. The men who made that call didn't understand the wide-ranging implications of their decision. They weren't aware of the way harm and imbalance would ripple out through the land that I'm certain that they loved dearly. But we humans, our fatal flaw is hubris. We think we know better than nature, and we think we know better than one another. The truth is that each of us is the world's foremost expert in exactly one field, our own life. Our own story, our vocation, the work that is uniquely ours to do. We waste so much energy trying to convince each other that I am right and you are wrong, and we waste even more energy trying to control one another. We ignore the fact that everyone has limits. Our perception is limited. Our intelligence is limited. Our capacity for action is limited. Our power is limited. Confined to tunnel vision by these limitations, we become stymied when there's a barrier that blocks our way. If we can't go over it, around it, or under it, we just bang our heads against that rock and then complain about the resulting headache. This is not helpful. So what are our alternatives? We can chip away at the rock. We can back up, regroup, look for another route. We can approach the rock with respect and curiosity, perhaps learn something about the rock or about ourselves. We can breathe. Everybody breathe. And remember geologic time and trust in the forces that eventually will erode the stone and make a way out of no way. We learn to think like a mountain, making space in our minds and hearts and spirits for a complexity that is beyond our understanding. To abandon the metaphor, we do the work that is in front of us and trust that if we do it well, with kindness and good intent, our efforts will be a part of the solution. We resist the temptation to catastrophize or demonize. We resist the temptation to withdraw into apathy or denial. We resist the temptation to otherize, to oversimplify. We keep on living and we keep on loving, even as we keep on facing those difficult truths. And in the process, almost in spite of ourselves, we grow wiser and more resilient. We find the beliefs that sustain us, and we find the communities that sustain us. Now, I'm a fairly new activist by comparison to some of the people in this room. And the other day, I was speaking to a more experienced activist in his 70s about hope. And I shared that in this moment, I'm choosing to believe that what we're living through right now is patriarchy's last stand. Notice, I don't say I think that or that there's evidence to support it necessarily, but that I choose to believe it, that these are the last days of white supremacist patriarchy. But my friend, he laughed at me. He said that's what they thought back in the 60s. I told him maybe in 25 years I'll look back at my 45-year-old self and think, oh my gosh, she was so naive. Nevertheless, my choice to believe that we're on the cusp of sea change or in the midst of a great turning, a great upheaval, that's what keeps me strong and focused and hopeful and resourceful. Which means that while in 25 years I may look back and think I was so naive, those 25 years will be made up of moments and hours, days and weeks and months and years where I was able to stay faithful to my deep values, where I worked for peace and for justice, just as my wise old friend has. Remember Jane Hirschfield's words, more and more I've come to admire resilience, not the simple resistance of a pillow whose foam returns over and over to the same shape, but the sinuous tenacity of a tree. Finding the light newly blocked on one side, it turns in another. A blind intelligence, true, but out of such persistence arose turtles, rivers, mitochondria, figs, all this resinous, unretractable earth. For immovable objects like racism, climate change, partisan division, poverty, suffering, there are unstoppable forces that ever so slowly melt them away. For every unavoidable given, there are as many different strategies for coping as there are humans. At every barrier, there is work to do that is uniquely mine, that is uniquely yours. Can we back up, take the larger perspective, and trust the wildness and the complexity that is so much a part of the fabric of our universe? Can we trust ourselves? Can we trust our good hearts? Can we trust each other? I believe we can. No, I believe we must. So be it, and so may it be.